Good afternoon, and welcome to Resistance in the Materials, a gathering of printers pressing for change. This is a two-day bi-coastal event with a companion session happening exactly 24 hours from now. Although we are gathered via Zoom, we understand that networks are always grounded. So we would like to begin by acknowledging the land occupied by our two host institutions with the following statements. First, for the University of Maryland. Every community owes its existence and strength to the generations before them, around the world, who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy into making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will. Some were drawn to migrate from their homes in hope of a better life, and some have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. Truth and acknowledgement are critical in building mutual respect and connections across all barriers of heritage and difference. At the Center for Literary and Comparative Studies and Book Lab, we believe it is important to create a dialogue to honor those who have been historically and systematically disenfranchised. So we acknowledge the truth that is often buried. We are on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people, who were among the first in the Western Hemisphere. We are on indigenous land that was stolen from the Piscataway people by European colonists. We pay respects to Piscataway elders and ancestors. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. I now call upon Dr. Kathy Aoki for Santa Clara University.
We pause to acknowledge that Santa Clara University sits on the land of the Ohlone and Muwekma Ohlone people, who trace their ancestry through the missions Dolores, Santa Clara, and San Jose. We remember their connection to this region and give thanks for the opportunity to live, work, learn, and pray on their traditional homeland. Let us take a moment of silence to pay respect to their elders and to all Ohlone people, past and present.
Thank you, Dr. Aoki. My name is Matthew Kirschenbaum. I'm a member of the faculty in the English department at the University of Maryland, where I also co-direct Book Lab, one of the sponsors for today's event. I'm going to say just a few quick words about the overall shaping and imagination of this gathering, and then turn things over to my colleagues to introduce our speakers this afternoon. Resistance in the Materials is a collaboration between the year-long anti-racism series at the University of Maryland's Center for Literary and Comparative Studies and the Center for the Arts and Humanities at Santa Clara University. The idea originated last fall when we realized we had common networks and common interests. From the get-go, we wanted to foreground printing as a mode of expression and communication that is activist, engaged, and alive, but also resistant and resilient, and above all, diverse, a practice whose modalities exceed letterpress or paper or any other single tradition, method, or medium. We invited printers of color and some allies, and we are so grateful and fortunate that every one of our invitees accepted. We also wanted to create a sense of liveness around the event itself, sometimes more difficult than it should be on a platform like this. At a moment when the US Postal Service was under political and ideological attack, we found ourselves reaching back to an earlier era of mail art, the stamp replacing the Wi-Fi connection and the envelope replacing the Zoom room. Mailing postcards and letters has long been a form of activism, a material and intentional way to press for change. So we asked our invited practitioners to engage in a mail art exchange with one another to help center and ground their remarks, so that our audience can easily access the work that resulted, we have created a slideshow available to you in Google Drive, and that link is in the chat. Think of it as a kind of catalog or pamphlet to accompany the talks today and tomorrow. Further, in the spirit of liveness, after tomorrow's roundtable session with 4 more of our invited practitioners, we will hold a pop-up mixer and print exchange. Any or all of you who will be able to briefly take an open mic and share your own print work if you so choose, or else just come along and hang out and enjoy the afterglow. You have that link in your Eventbrite confirmation for today. Finally, on behalf of my fellow organizers, Carrie Krause and Aaron Bartlett here at the University of Maryland, and Kathy Aoki and Kirsten Luner at Santa Clara, I would like to thank the entities that have supported and sponsored Resistance in the Materials. The Center for Literary and Comparative Studies here, and the Center for the Arts and Humanities at Santa Clara. We also especially thank Doctors Michelle Burnham, Tita Chico, Karen Nelson, and Amy Randall in their capacity as administrators for those centers, as well as Maryland graduate students Liam Daly and Danielle Griffin for their behind-the-scenes work and coordination. So this afternoon, we will hear 2 talks in plenary format, each about 20 or 25 minutes. We then look forward to a robust discussion period. Please do at any time submit questions and comments via Zoom's Q&A feature. We'll be collecting those and keeping them for the discussion period. And our hashtag is pressing for change, and that's the numeral 4, pressing for change. And I'll now turn things over to my colleague, Dr. Carrie Krause, who will introduce our first speaker, Dr. Lillian-Yvonne Bertram. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you everyone for joining us today. As Matt said, my name is Carrie Krause. I'm an associate professor in the Department of English and the College of Information Studies at UMD. It is my honor today to introduce Dr. Lillian-Yvonne Bertram as one of our 2 plenary speakers. Dr. Bertram is an associate professor in the Department of English at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, where they teach in and direct the MFA in Creative Writing program. They are the author of the poetry collections Travesty Generator and winner of the 2018 Noemi Press Poetry Prize and finalist for the National Poetry Series. Travesty Generator received the 2020 Poetry Society of America Anna Rabinowitz Prize for interdisciplinary and venturesome work. I first encountered Dr. Bertram's work in 2020 while searching for contemporary examples of combinatorial poetry to include on my digital humanities syllabus. A genre with a history dating back to the 1950s, combinatorial poetry uses both original and found source material to algorithmically generate new verse. Dr. Bertram, I soon discovered, had brilliantly torn the old form down to the studs, subsequently rebuilding it to amplify and give voice and expression to Black lives. Bertram's Doc at Tubman's Rock, published in circa 2018, uses the found skeletal frame of poet Nanny Bellestrini's 1961 programmed poem, Tape Mark 1, to link the stories of Harriet Tubman, Black abolitionist, nurse, soldier, suffragette, and former enslaved person, and Emmett Till, the 14-year-old Black boy brutally murdered in Mississippi in 1955 after being accused of offending a white woman. Now, if you've never experienced computer-generated verse, then you should understand the power of a print command at the end of a program loop, which is to continually output new permutations of the poem's source material. Bertram harnesses that capacity in the poem's social commentary and depicted anguish, gathering strength and force as new stanzas are generated in perpetuity. This is the power of print, not just the impression, but the repetition, the repeated insistence. Please join me in welcoming artist, teacher, professor, and scholar, Dr. Lillian-Yvonne Bertram, to the Resistance in the Materials event.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Oh, somebody else has to stop. Oh, just give me a thumbs up, panelists, if you can see the screen. Yep, all right, awesome. Thank you. Good afternoon. I just want to thank everyone for being here in the audience and for being invited by the University of Maryland English Department and Book Lab and Santa Clara University. Special thanks to the organizers for all of their logistical work in the virtual environment, especially Carrie Krause, Matthew Kirschenbaum, Karen Nelson, Kathy Aoki, Tita Chico, and Kirsten Leuner. And special thanks too to Jonathan for making and sending a beautiful print. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a poem generator that I made called Forever Gwen Brooks, which you can access at forevergwenbrooks.com. And I'll talk for roughly 20 minutes or so. And I'm going to minimize the video on my screen, so I won't be able to see anything, and I'm not going to check in on the chat box. So I'm just going to assume that everything is going to go okay. And we'll just go from there. So, in the late 1960s, at the height of the civil rights movement, poet Gwendolyn Brooks made the decision to leave her publisher of many years, the large New York-based Harper & Row, for the new, small, Black-owned and Detroit-based publisher Broadside Press. One way of looking at this move is that Brooks, whose poetry centers Black people, Black communities, and Black life, chose to publish Black. As Brooks herself put it, "My first duty is to the estimable developing Black publishing companies." The choice of publisher is at once a resistance to the white-dominated publishing industry and an affirmation of Black nationalist principles. Brooks chose to forego further royalties from a publisher like Harper & Row, and even chose to invest her Broadside Press royalties back into the press itself. Without the distribution channels and connections of a major trade publisher, this move meant it would have been more difficult for Brooks's readers to find her work, but the move is nonetheless in keeping with Brooks's social commitments to the Black community. And this 1969 book, which is really a chapbook, Riot, was the first book produced by Broadside Press. And as you can see, it cost $1, which is amazing. So just briefly about this chapbook, which is actually a long poem in 3 parts. Riot is a poem in 3 parts. The first section is titled Riot. The second is titled The Third Sermon on the Warpland. And the last is titled An Aspect of Love Alive in the Ice and Fire. Altogether, the poems depict riots in Chicago after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The first part, Riot, uses the figure of John Cabot, a white man from suburban Chicago, to depict the irrelevance of trying to understand the riot from the white liberal humanist perspective and from outside the community. An image of that poem is on the screen. The riot is described from Cabot's point of view, which, along with Cabot as a person, are openly mocked by the omniscient narrator. The second section, the third sermon on the Warpland, is prefaced by an epigraph alluding to the phoenix of Egyptian mythology that rises, renewed from the ashes. This section includes vignettes that give voice to the rioters, other community members, and occasional interjections by outsider white liberals. The voices of the community demonstrate that even within the rioters, their feelings and experiences are not monolithic or are at times irreconcilable. The book ends with the poem An Aspect of Love Alive in the Ice and Fire, a poem depicting the intimate moments of 2 lovers the day after the riot. Ice and fire offer opposing forces alongside the love, affirmation, and pride in Blackness and Black nationalism. This poem also forms the basis of the poetry generator that I'll talk about in a little bit. So I include this poem and the history about the book Riot, not only because it's interesting and useful, but because this switch of publishers changed the material condition through which readers of poetry and of Gwendolyn Brooks's work in particular were now forced to encounter her work. As John Sullivan puts it, through a specifically African-American context. Whereas previously, readers of her poetry were encountering her work through a specific, if unspoken, white American context. White editors, white publishers, white printers, white readers. With a much smaller distribution network, readers might have had to venture into Black-owned spaces. bookstores, cultural stores to locate this specifically Black material. Black author text, printed by a Black publisher, available at Black bookstores, greatly decreased the likelihood of anyone's reading the poem through a lens of universal white humanism, which the poem itself is attempting to critique. Riot, then, as a material object, a printed object, to be approached and appreciated through a Black context. Previous reviewers of Gwendolyn Brooks had read and discussed her work as fine examples of poems and not Negro poems, while their own critical responses were suffocated by a racial logic through which they could only read her work as good despite her being a Negro. Relocating the material reality of publishing made it much harder to strip away this fact of Brooks's Blackness. Fast forward. I first encountered Riot in the Third World Press edition of Blacks. Third World Press is also a Black-owned press, and Blacks is a compilation of, or a collection of all of Brooks's work. You probably can't see this because of the virtual background, but that's what it is. I'm holding it up. We're trying to, at least. I then encountered Riot a second time in facsimile and in JPEG form via the Eclipse archive assembled by Craig Dworkin, which is online. I only encountered the actual physical object of Riot at the Woodbury Poetry Room, a large poetry holding in the rarefied atmosphere of Harvard University. And an image of the Woodbury Poetry Room is on the screen. It's a lovely place dedicated all to poetry, which is fantastic. But I want to pause here and consider this because the material condition of finding a hard to find text at Harvard University includes a process that involves finding your way to the campus, taking a train or paying for parking, passing through a metal detector, showing some sort of ID, navigating to the actual room where the text is held. It's a place that the public can go to, but it's one of those places that are heavily gatekept, and you definitely get that feeling when you try to go there. As I leafed through the actual printed version of Riot, an image of the frontispiece, which is on the screen, I noted how the text of previous pages could be seen through the current page, as if in a form of palimpsest. And I think if you flip through numerous books, you get the same effect, right? You can see the text kind of bleeding through, depending on how thick the page is or how heavy the ink is. I began to wonder if it would be possible to read and experience the entire book, the previous material, the previous pages, all through the lens of the closing poem, an aspect of love alive in the ice and fire. This ultimately led to the forevergwenbrooks.com project, a poetry generator that uses randomization to generate infinite iterations of the closing poem, or infinite experiences of the lexicon of the entire book that is Riot. So let me explain a little bit about how I do this. So I think, as Carrie mentioned in the introduction, there's a lot of power in that print command and in the combinatorial function, especially when it's combined with randomization. So to make a poetry generator, particularly this one, what I do is turn the poem into a template. And in this case, it's based on parts of speech. So things like nouns, verbs, and adjectives are all marked. And those parts of speech are swapped out with corresponding parts of speech, but at random. So the corpus of the entire generator is the book that is Riot. And that text is passed through the generator in a form of reading the book through the closing poem. I'll try and make this make more sense. So the images on this slide are examples on the left side of an early template draft typed out in plain text, and then a screenshot of the working website. So as you can see, the line 0, which I've marked here, it is the noun of our noun. It's just like kind of like a quick and dirty, way of turning this line of poetry into sort of like constants and variables, right? Breaking it down into its like lexical parts. And that maps onto this generated line. It is the mythology of our America. It is the noun of our noun. And so I went through and I did this with each line of the poem. And this is an early template draft. So it's not the ultimate, it's not the final template draft, but it represents sort of like the strategy of how I went about turning the printed text into a form that the computer could use. So the noun of our noun These nouns are chosen at random in the program, and they choose from a corpus of nouns that all come from the book that is Riot. So this is an example of the word corpus that is actually at the back end of the poetry generator. So you saw I just circled nouns on the previous screen. Here is the category noun that all of the nouns are drawn from at random. Same thing with adjective, verb, personal pronoun, reflexive pronoun, possessive pronoun. So the program selects these at random and funnels them through. And so this is the back end in the programming environment that I use, which is a Jupyter notebook running Python 3. The web page itself is JavaScript and HTML, but I use Python and Jupyter notebooks to design the initial structures. And so while I initially did all of this by hand, because Riot is maybe in total 1,000 words, so it wasn't difficult to kind of pull out nouns and adjectives and things by hand. In subsequent versions of the program, I used part of speech tagging in Python to isolate these word categories. And here's the actual functional code that selects from the corpus. And if you remember to just a couple slides ago, we have the same line 0 that's now in code doing the work of that template, right? It is the noun of our noun. Only now the nouns are being chosen at random. And this is the actual code in Python on the back end. And this is an image of the webpage, which anyone can access at forevergwenbrooks.com. And so with each click of the button down here, a new version of an aspect of love alive in the ice and fire is generated. No versions are saved, so each one is temporary and fleeting unless you copy and paste yourself or take a screenshot like I've done here. So what's interesting to me about the versions that this generator produces is that they contain the same energy of the original poem, but also the energy of the entire book, and this energy of resistance and Black nationalism, and at times practical skepticism about an American future. No doubt in part because the text is all coming from the previous pages of the book, right? In this aspect of trying to read through the entire book through one of the poems. So another version of this poem opens, "It is the rank of our time." Another opens, "It is the blackness of our hair." Again, the energy and language of the community recirculates. And so part of the impetus behind this project was to extend the text, the riot and its aftermath, and also Brooks's lexicon into this digital space. So now on the screen are images that represent some of the prints that I sent Jonathan. And so what these are scans of transparencies, and printed on the transparencies are textual outputs from the poetry generator, specifically the Python one. And if you go into the slide deck that was posted in the chat, you can see these up close on your own. So they represent for me both the physical and computational encounters with the poem An Aspect of Love Alive in the Ice and Fire. And as you can see, as the title is also something that gets randomly generated, you can read some of the titles pretty clearly, right? An aspect of hats alive in the smoke and chatter, an aspect of jerk alive in the hell and earth, an aspect of goldenrod alive in the cookies and chatter, an aspect of men alive in the virginity and man. So what intrigued me about printing on transparencies was this element of seeing through and reading through, which I was trying to capture the experience of actually handling the physical text of Riot, where I could see the words through the page. And so they also represent, you know, sort of like reading the whole book through the structure of the poem at the same time that this actual printing makes the text permanent and creates a permanence out of what is otherwise a random ephemeral moment, right? Because each time you press a button on the generator or each time I run it in Python, the previous version is erased. So the chances of it coming around again are like infinitesimally small, right? Because there's so many random elements in the actual generator. This is another scan. And so again, like the printed text of other poems that was visible through the paper pages of the physical book, the different versions can be somewhat seen through the layered transparencies, But in this layering, the permanence is more obstructed, right? You can't read it easily. And some of the transparencies were printed on more than once. And for me, this forces a kind of palimpsest, right? Drawing your eye to the foreground and the background and navigating between those two to see, you know, to try and accomplish a reading of text that's been made purposely illegible. So I initially made these prints for inclusion in an issue of Obsidian. This issue, What Tell Freedom Now, came out in 2019. And I thought this was fitting because Obsidian is a journal that is dedicated to literature and arts in the African diaspora, which echoes Brooks's own publishing commitments. So I want to turn now to the print that Jonathan sent me, and this is one of the images. And again, this image is available in the slide deck, which has been posted in the chat. And so this idea of palimpsest was also on my mind when looking at Jonathan's print, in that it's physically layered. And I was really excited to get this print because I've been thinking a lot about palimpsest and thinking a lot about obstruction and physicality and reading through text and using different structures of text to read text through it, and what's legible and what's illegible and different kinds of meanings that can arise. So when I got this, I was like, oh, this is really fitting because this has just sort of been on my mind. So it's a very physically layered piece, and I have it here, but I'm not going to show it to you because you're not going to be able to see it well with the virtual background. But the pieces of paper are layered one on top of the other, and to achieve a legibility of the phrase that's been printed, you have to manipulate the pieces of paper. And I think if you look closely, you can kind of see that there are like holes cut into this piece of paper, and I'm holding this piece of paper back, right? So the phrase that's revealed reads, "You are more than your contribution to state workforce needs." Also very fitting to get these at a time when, you know, there's just, everything is so busy and it's all about productivity. So aside from how this resonated with me on a personal level, given the relentless grind of academia, it also made me think of Gwendolyn Brooks. And so again, while I don't have the statistics on it exactly, I do know that Brooks's move from Harper and Row to Broadside Press would have meant this loss in royalties, which makes me think about the precariousness of Black life and how supporting Black-owned publishers and supporting the community might have meant reduced income for Gwendolyn Brooks and maybe a reduced level of financial security. Obviously, it should not have to be one or the other. A Black woman should not have to be tied to a publishing, printing, and distribution schema controlled by white editors who have a limited perspective through which to view her work. But I don't mean to suggest that in choosing Black, it be viewed as a sacrifice or limitation, because it's not, and Brooks did not see it that way. Similarly, my medium is poetry, and computational poetry is part of a creative strategy that I employ. But I specifically choose to use the materials of this strategy to focus exclusively on the work of Black writers and to consider aspects of Black life, similar to what Carrie was talking about in the introduction with my poem, Tubman's Rock. So through computation, I enact a strategy of choosing Black. But in thinking more about being worth more than my contribution to state workforce needs, and I do work for the state directly, I began to consider my own productivity and the fact that I am, perhaps like many of us, rapidly approaching burnout levels if I'm not there already. As a Black person in overwhelmingly white academic spaces, I'm routinely called upon to do significant additional work, usually as a token diversity representative. So the emphasis on constant productivity makes it almost impossible to think, to spend any time really considering ideas, or as I like to call it, steeping. With that in mind, I made the following as sort of a response to Jonathan's print. And this is not in the slide deck because I didn't send it, but I made this in response. This is kind of more like a call to myself to engage in my own kind of personal work stoppage, which is not a riot, but what would constitute the language of my not being heard as a Black woman in academic spaces, a stoppage so that I can steep. And this particular artifact, which is cardstock, gesso, stamps, and ink, deliberately holds echoes of the physical text of Riot, especially the cover, with the Black background, the printable white area in the foreground, red text, and contrasting text. And this, for me, is going to serve as a reminder for the ways that I can use text, materials, and computation to stage my own interventions into fundamentally racist structures, and hopefully in the process envision a path to liberation. And I'm going to stop there and turn it back over to the organizers. And I will post in the chat a link to the Forever Gwen Brooks generator, which anyone can go ahead and use and generate infinite versions of the poem, An Aspect of Love Alive in the Ice and Fire. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing from Jonathan in Mere Moments.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bertram. Hi, everyone. My name is Aaron Bartlett. I am a doctoral candidate at the University of Maryland in the English department. I'm also one of the co-organizers of today's event. It is my pleasure today to introduce to you Dr. Jonathan Sentin. Dr. Sentin is an associate professor of book history and print culture in the Information School at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, as well as an affiliated faculty member in the Department of Art History, the Center for Design and Material Culture, and the Material Culture Studies program. He is also the director of the Center for the History of Print and Digital Culture at the University of Wisconsin. He has been a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellow at the American Antiquarian Society and was the Pine Tree Foundation Distinguished Visiting Fellow in the Future of the Book in a Digital Age at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Jonathan is the co-editor of the 2019 collection, Against a Sharp White Background, Infrastructures of African American Print, and author of The Intimacy of Paper in Early 19th Century American Literature. His approach to the study of material print culture has sought to draw attention to the ways that the materiality of printed matter is implicated in the political and social construction of gender, labor, and race. Jonathan is himself a practicing letterpress printer whose work often explores political issues. Through his teaching, scholarship, and work at Wisconsin Center for the History of Print and Digital Culture, he strives to integrate hands-on practice with archival knowledge. Dr. Sentin, thank you very much for being with us today. We're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. It's an honor to be a guest of the University of Maryland English Department, Center for Literary Studies and Book Lab, as well as the Santa Clara University Center for Arts and Humanities. I've been keeping up with all the wonderful work you've been doing this year, and all of you have really done so much to sustain those of us who love to touch paper and get ink on our hands and to talk with each other face to face. You've all done so much to sustain us out here in the Zoom and on YouTube, and also creating resources that are going to be wonderful for students once we do return to face or otherwise instruction in the future. So I'm so grateful to be here, and for all the organizers and the fellow printmakers, and to Lillian-Yvonne for sending me this. I'm the only one who had the pleasure of listening to you while holding the transparencies. And I'm really looking forward to the ways in which our talks have turned out. I think because we were looking at each other's works as planned, I hope I suspect by the organizers, to see where we have quite a bit of overlap. So thank you to all. And I am going to share this and run the slideshow. Okay, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about, I'm using the occasion of this print, Wisconsin Ideas, or You Are More Than Your Contribution to State Workforce Needs, in order to think through some questions about what letterpress what letterpress does and can do in a number of different settings, and also what it has done for my thinking and teaching. I should also say at the outset here, this is the first time that I'm appearing anywhere as a printer, instead of as necessarily as a primary, scholar of book history or print culture. And so I've been thinking about that among the ways in which I'm honored to be here with these distinguished guests of these centers. A moment at which I am being hailed as a printer is special to me. It really is, because it comes at a time in which I am. I got tenure last year and have been thinking about what kind of work I want to do, and how I might not only use letterpress and my experience as a printer to enrich my historical work and work in material texts, but to begin to use my print, my work as a printer as scholarship, as research, as arguments about the world and things that I care about. And this print is one of those things, and it's something that has focalized a number of different questions and experiences that I've had in the last 5 years. So here's a map. There's two main threads for this. One of them is kind of walking through different dimensions of this print for its needs, a little bit about how I came to be a printer, while thinking about how this print, how its layers would come together. And then turning towards what I've learned from Amos Paul Kennedy, who did his MFA here at UW-Madison, and some of his early work that we have here in our art library, and some of the things that it's taught me about what letterpress can do in the world. So that's just a little map. Lillian-Yvonne helpfully already showed this print. This is what it looks like when you take it out of the tube or lay it flat. And Lillian-Yvonne had suggested that there are cutouts there. Yes, and it initially reads, "You are a contribution to state workforce needs," with some letters that were printed there, cut out with an X-Acto knife. It then lays over another layer which restores those letters. "You are more than your contribution to state workforce needs." There's a layer in which what has been cut out has been stuck in place. It again, there's a battle between "you are" and "you are more than," right before finally getting to the last opening of this print, where it reads, "You are more than your contribution to state workforce needs." Now, those words and what they mean, and why I layered them in the way that I did, or why I started to think through layers with them, is part of the story of the last 5 years. This is me in my garage with my press. This is from a video I made for my students who are learning book history and print culture letterpress via Zoom. And so I recorded an hour-long video for them, showing them the process from start to finish. I did this on a day when it was -4 outside. And so it was quite cold. But this is the Easy Hill Press, which is an imprint. This particular one probably once belonged to Walter Hamady, the Madison, Wisconsin book artist, papermaker, printer, and teacher. Its bed fits a full spread of a standard size daily newspaper. It is 2,300 pounds. It's a lot. So where did the Easy Hill Press imprint come from? It was started by my grandparents in the 1950s. It was part of a series of different presses that they operated. My grandparents owned and operated an industrial job printing press in Buffalo, and that was the William J. Keller Press. It was eventually sold, and it was eventually sort of taken over and incorporated into Jostens, the yearbook company, because by the end of by the late middle 20th century, they were pretty much producing recently because it was a pretty lucrative market. So those are my grandparents. But while they were doing this, they also had their own imprint, the Easy Hill Press. They were part of a bibliophilic club called the Salisbury Club of Buffalo. And then after they sold the yearbook business, they became affiliated with a press called the Paradise Press in Buffalo. And these are a series of presses that sort of trace all the way back to the Roycrofters, or an American arts and crafts movement that is kind of coextensive with the late Victorian English arts and crafts movement. They produced a number of different volumes under the Easy Hill imprints. Many things were sort of ephemeral, but occasionally they would produce books in collaboration with rare books libraries, specifically at the University of Buffalo. So they printed James Joyce's Epiphanies, which came out of manuscript at the University of Buffalo after they acquired the Joyce manuscripts. They also published a speech that Mark Twain gave at a local high school, Samuel Clemens gave at a local high school when he was editor of the Buffalo Express in the 1850s. And so this is some of the fine printing work that they did under the Easy Hill imprint or the Salisbury Club imprint, and are a part of the way in which I learned how to pay attention to the materiality of print. And I decided to take over the imprint after their deaths and after I got my own access to a press. But one of the things that my grandfather impressed upon me was the way in which his father wanted to do printing. He only ever wanted to handle the graphic arts and design aspects. And so he recalled to me that when he finally retired, the happiest moment was that he was able to pay attention to letterpress rather than to the business aspects of offset printing of yearbooks. And that's something that has been in my mind as I've lived through the last decade. Which brings us to the Wisconsin idea. So what is the Wisconsin idea that is in the title of my talk and in the piece that I produced? The Wisconsin idea is a kind of orienting principle of this University of Wisconsin system, but also sort of baked into public life in this region of the upper Midwest. And it is the idea that the university, all of its campuses, should touch the lives of every family across the state. And so in 1904, Chancellor Van High said, "I won't be content until the beneficent influence of the university reaches every family in the state." This is, a lot of this is behind university extension, dairy science, agricultural science, but it also was part of the formation of the library school where I work now, which is the information school these days. It's also part of interactions between political scientists and historians and the state government, a progressive era idea that looks completely foreign to state university legislature relationships today, but which was bedrock for this university and this state for many, many decades, and not just in the progressive period. In 2011, Tracy Hahn, master printer and operator of the Silver Buckle Press at UW-Madison Libraries, also printed this famous statement about academic freedom at UW-Madison. Whatever may be the limitations which trammel inquiry elsewhere, we believe that the great state University of Wisconsin should ever encourage the continuous and fearless sifting and winnowing by which alone the truth can be found. These two concepts, the beneficent influence of the university touching all corners of the state and the continual and fearless sifting and winnowing, are the sort of bedrock principles of a University of Wisconsin that would be recognizable 15 years ago, and that people still hang on to because these are important principles, but which have come under edit we might say, or outright attack within the last 10 years. It's 10 years to last week since the budget repair bill of Act 10 and then the following Wisconsin uprising, which you might remember. And so all of what I'm about to discuss happens in the wake of those historical events and have to do with edits to these ideas. So in 2015, Governor Scott Walker decided he was going to run for president and attempt to become the Republican nominee for the presidency, and was doing a number of sort of political moves in state, largely having to do with the budget of and public employees, following up on Act 10 of 2011. And he was an early favorite for the Republican nomination before being outflanked to the right by Donald J. Trump. But as part of the budget for 2015-16, Scott Walker directed changes to the mission of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And those of us who work here and live in this state and elsewhere who care about public education and the academy, et cetera, paid a lot of attention to these documents that were being edited literally in the middle of the night and coming out in the press and being shared all over Facebook. And so those years of 2015 and 16, I spent inundated by documents like this one, where you would have state statute and then find parts of it under erasure or highlighted, deletions, edits, additions. In this one in particular, the Wisconsin idea was written out of the university's mission. And so here you see that the mission of the system is to develop human resources, and underlined text here are additions, to meet the state's workforce needs, to discover and disseminate knowledge. And then what had been deleted from this is extend knowledge and its application beyond the boundaries of its campuses and serve and stimulate society by developing students' heightened intellectual, cultural, and humane sensitivities. The following was also deleted. Inherent in this broad mission are methods of instruction, research, extended training, public service, designed to educate people and improve the human condition. Basic to every purpose of the system is the search for truth. So it was being leaked out of the legislature daily that these changes were being requested. This blew up mightily because it turns out that when you talk about not extending the boundaries of the campuses across the entire state, you're also talking about not helping goat milk farmers and stuff like that. But this was followed by other deletions and additions. And I guess what I want to focus on, in addition to that language of inserting meet state workforce needs and deleting knowledge, extend knowledge and its application, or searching for truth, the extent to which we spent that year combing over variants in documents, deletions, insertions, tracking changes, if I might cite one of our wonderful hosts, in documents that were being produced and archived in the state government. Another one was changes to tenure, the deletion of tenure status from state statute. And so we were later in the year looking at documents like this one, delete the definition of a tenure appointment and language establishing the conditions under which the Board of Regents may grant tenure, delete current law specifying that a person who has been granted tenure may be dismissed only for just cause and only after due notice and hearing, delete the definition of probationary appointment and provisions limiting the length of such an appointment to 7 years. So delete, 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 add. We were swimming in these kinds of documents. At that time, on my own Facebook wall, I took Tracy's, or in my iPhone, I took Tracy's print and did a quick sort of found poetry revise on it and changed that statement about the continual sifting and winnowing. Changed it to whatever, limit and trammel inquiry. We believe that the State University of Wisconsin should ever encourage continual fear, by which alone money can be found. That was edited on my iPhone. But I took to Tracy's print, modifying it with my iPhone in order to express my continuing frustration, but also a kind of just a recognition of the way that the deletion of documents and the deletion of words were really changing and literally radically revising core principles of the university, the state, and the spirit of the state. And that is eventually where this document grew out of, or I'm sorry, this print. I took to setting the type, you are more than a contribution to state workforce needs, because I needed to be reminded of it. And I made bookmarks for my students that said these things. Originally, these long strips were originally meant to be bookmarks for my students. And I like the printing of mottos because they're short. They don't take that long to set the type on, and they are meant to be repeated. And I think in that repetition, there's a certain kind of soothing or reflective process. So I was thinking about this at first as just a motto that I would hand out to students here. And other book artists whose work I really appreciated in the way that they take up material forms in order to make arguments. I started to think more about layers and layering and the way in which a piece like this could be a contest. Thinking about layering and the layering of meaning, but also notions of transparency that I hadn't thought of in terms of government transparency, sunshine laws. At the same time as all of those changes were occurring with state statute, there were, of course, downstream budget effects at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. This was in 2016, following these budget cuts, Tracy Hahn decided to retire, which was well-deserved. But due to budget cuts, the library did not hire a new librarian artist to operate the Silver Buckle Press. And so it was given on what is essentially a permanent loan to the Hamilton Woodtype Museum in Two Rivers, Wisconsin, which is about 2.5 hours away from here. But in addition to the loss of the press as a teaching tool here on campus, one of the things that hurt me the most was the way in which this was framed as an expression of the Wisconsin idea, because the press would be moving elsewhere in the state. And I thought that was a particularly cynical way to message around essentially a staffing cut that led to the loss of a full press and a librarian artist who operated it and taught with it. The Silver Buckle Press was here since the 1970s. It was acquired. It was the personal press of Robert Shafto, who was the art director at Ford Motor Company, and he sold it to UW-Madison on the principle that it be used for teaching and that it never be divided up and sold out and chopped up into different pieces, which in the end was one of the reasons why it was moved to the Hamilton Woodtype Museum in Two Rivers, Wisconsin. I do want to say, though I think that the situation was handled cynically when a librarian administrator called this an expression of the Wisconsin idea to cut budget and send this thing to a museum. I don't have any animosity towards Tracy for retiring or for the folks at the Hamilton Woodtype Museum, who are truly great artists and curators and keepers of the history of printing. It is just that it is 2.5 hours away, and though they told us that there would be efforts to bridge that gap, that never came to be. Okay, so what do we do? Well, we got on eBay and Craigslist, and instead of having a full, a historic and full service press and facility and a dedicated teacher, we started buying what little we could in order to do very, very basic letterpress work here on campus, which is something that's probably familiar to a lot of you who have been combing eBay and Craigslist and whatever and trying to get what little pieces you can. One of the nice things about this is that the presses are small enough that we can take them to public libraries. And so we now do Wisconsin Idea work by taking our tiny little proof presses out into public libraries. And this is one of our librarians, Anjali Basine, who has since gone on to work elsewhere, but was instrumental in setting up our new tiny press. Okay, so to close, as I began to think about myself as a printer, I started looking at the arguments and methods that Amos P. Kennedy was using, and learning a lot from his current work, and also studying his work from when he was a student here at UW-Madison. And again, I'm really taken by the use of layering here, and the way in which there are multiple contested, sometimes confusing, difficult to read, but nonetheless insistent messages layered in his work. And I'm standing here with the cover that he did for our book. We said, Amos, can you do a cover for our book? And he sent us 300 covers to our book, and we had to pick which one, because no two are the same because of the mixtures of ink and all of that. And that was combing through 300 different of these was one of my first lessons in the complexity of the layering in his work. But we do have in our art library Amos Kennedy's early work when he was a student, especially the early work when he's doing work more with books. And that's one of the remarkable things here in the trajectory of his career, is that when he was a student, he was working with the book form. And after that, he moved more to the kind of poster broadside that you're more familiar with from now. This is a book called Mask, in which he was working with African mask forms and also African-American poetry. Paul Laurence Dunbar's We Wear the Mask is juxtaposed in this book with figures of African masks that he was printing here and elsewhere. But as I got deeper into his student work and what he was doing here in Wisconsin, as he was learning from Hamady and others, I found this fascinating little book called Historical Women and also My Life that he did with, at the time, a girl in Racine named Plachette Robinson. Historical Women / My Life is a do-si-do. So one side of the book is Historical Women and the other side is My Life. And you flip over. In one continuous book form, you have two texts that are, again, layered and in conversation with one another. The first is 3 poems about Harriet Tubman, Rosa Parks, and Sojourner Truth. And in the colophon, Plachette writes, Plachette printed this in August 1995 after visiting her cousin in Atlanta. She saw Martin Luther King's boyhood home, so perhaps our next book will be about Dr. King. Plachette chose the colors, made the paper, did the printing, and will bind these books. The edition is of 50, many of which will go to her family and friends. You turn it over and it says, My Life. And here Plachette narrates her life. She says, Plachette is on the basketball team. I like tall, skinny, black. I look like tall, skinny, black hair, brown eyes, light-skinned, helpful, intelligent, with different personalities, beautiful. Over the summer, I went to Minneapolis, Minnesota. She tells more of her plans. She wants to move to Arizona. She wants to have 1 child. She writes in the colophon here, this is the 3rd letterpress book made by Plachette Robinson. She worked with Amos Paul Kennedy Jr. on her Harriet Tubman book as part of the Victory and Peace program. This is the 2nd book we have made. It is my hope that we will continue to make books together as Plachette grows up. The books will perhaps afford a glimpse into the life of an inner city child as she matures. Plachette made the cover papers, chose the colors, printed the text pages, bound part of this edition. If there are profits to be made from this venture, she will share them. There are 50 books in this edition. So and this is my wrap up. As I was looking into how this book came to be between Amos and Plachette in 1995, I found out more about the artworks. I found out more about the Victory and Peace program. And this is Brooke Robinson, who I think may be Plachette's younger sister, working on a printing press in 1996 at the VIP Book Project. And this was at a home and arts and educational center for quote unquote troubled youth. Victory in Progress was originally called the Gang Diversion project, but the kids wanted to rename it. These teens and preteens wanted to rename it Victory in Progress. And it is an art and book arts program that was run between a museum in Racine and the Worcester Museum and this Center for Children in Racine, which is just south of Milwaukee. And I became fascinated with the way in which Amos was clearly using the book arts to live the Wisconsin idea that would touch every family in the state. And in particular, not by going in the direction of dairy science or agriculture, but by taking book arts to Racine, taking book arts to the program for gang diversion, or as these children would rather have called it, the Victory and Peace program. And so I'll end here with a much younger Amos Kennedy working with kids to make books, to use the power of making with one's hands, of layering one's experiences, of layering materials, paper, ink, print, in order to make meaning and express oneself. And so as I go forward as a printer, I'm also looking back at who has come before me at this institution and how they have used what they know how to do with their hands and their minds and the materials before them to make books and make lives in this place. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both Jonathan and Lillian-Yvonne. And it's so fitting that you ended, Jonathan, with Amos Kennedy. Some folks will know that he was visiting Maryland pretty much exactly 1 year ago today. And that was just before everything closed for the pandemic, the last good thing to happen, as we refer to it with sort of bitter sweetness.
His early books were the last thing that I saw on campus. I taught with those in the last day I was teaching in person.
Wow. I thought we do have some questions queued up, but I thought I would just give both of you the opportunity to just briefly perhaps respond or dialogue with one another along whatever lines seem opportune.
Yeah, totally. Jonathan, I couldn't help but notice you had a Go Bills scarf and a Bills hat. I'm from Buffalo, so I'm super, yeah.
Me too.
So I was like, wait a minute, is you from Buffalo? Yeah. And so like your sort of discussion of, I mean, like Buffalo has such a rich print culture and literary culture and just like literary community and stuff that's like really very like community based. And I was just sort of like listening to what sounds like this like lineage of printing and community based printing that has led to like your work, but also, you know, the work that you're doing in Wisconsin and communities. And also in my mind, I was connecting it to Broadside Press as a community-based publisher, which then merged with Lotus Press, and they're still the oldest like Black-owned publishers in the country, I think. And that, so I don't know, it just got me thinking about like the importance of lineage somewhere in there, right? In maintaining these important community relationships, especially around publishing and what that can mean, right? Especially outside of the context of massive mainstream trade publishing, right? Like where one's maybe like printing and publishing as a means of exercising and making real, right, one's social commitments, which it looks like is also kind of the work with Amos Kennedy and the Wisconsin idea. So I'm just, that's not a question. I'm just like, you know, kind of tossing that out there. It's just things that I was thinking about, and just the importance of those legacies and lineages and histories, especially in places, I mean, like Wisconsin, like Racine, but also like Buffalo, like Rust Belt towns, you know. So I don't know, yeah, and go Bills.
That's great. Thinking about the printing press as a site of industrial production or material production, and also of literary and aesthetic production. I remember when I was an English major in college, taking some of the books that my grandparents had made to an English professor and saying, I I'm interested in these as material objects. What do I do with that? And if I had gone to a different professor, they might have been able to answer that question, but they couldn't. They just said, well, we don't do that. We read these things. And I'm like, well, but I care about the fact that like, these are things to read, but they are also in particular, they're made in a particular way, and they require certain machinery. They require stuff that my dad, who worked at a newspaper, but not as a writer, but as an electrician and as a pressman, knows how to do. And it's sort of the press is the site where both of those kinds of work come together. And so I've always been interested in the way in which, like in Buffalo, there's just all kinds of like industrial machinery lying around. And so it's not that uncommon to like find a printing press somewhere, or like somebody has one in their basement because their grandpa had one or something. And so there are odd places where, because you're close to working class people or people who work with machines in the 20th century, you end up finding what now seem like access to like elite arts material.
It reminds me too so much of, I'm sure it, Rust Belt Books, right?
Yeah.
As a place where, like, gosh, I used to, and I apologize for turning this into a Buffalo Love Fest, but Rust Belt Books is a place, obviously, that served the community, did readings, all that kind of stuff, but also is a place where you could find like a pretty strong selection of handmade and small batch printed zines and books by local authors.
Yeah.
So I know there are some questions in the Q&A that I don't want to miss those, right, as we reminisce about Buffalo. But I did think it was important to kind of bring up, or at least highlight, that like the decades of history that are really important in like the legacies of printing, and who and what gets printed and by whom, right? So yeah.
I think we're all happy to sort of feel grounded any way we can here in the Zoom room. So there are a couple of questions in the chat that seem to be asking about different modes of sort of distribution. One of them, for example, is asking Dr. Bertram if you've considered using the transparencies for projection, for example, maybe on the side of buildings, I think the way that we sometimes see done nowadays. And then another question about the capacity of the generator for different kinds of digital distribution, maybe something like a Twitter feed or something like that. And then that's also making me think about something I wanted to ask you, Jonathan, which really is how you think about your work in terms of circulation, distribution, the Wisconsin idea, right? How do you get one of your letterpress prints to touch, in theory, every person in the state? So different kinds of networks and modes of distribution, I think, is the question, and how they relate to your work.
Those are very thorough, thorough questions. I'm interested in this idea of the projection of the transparency. I mean, there's a lot more that could be done with it than I have done with it, in part just sort of due to like other kinds of material and physical limitations and constraints. And also they're no longer in my possession. Jonathan has them. so there is that. That's also maybe the ephemeral element, right? Like once they're sent off, they're kind of gone. As for, I think there probably is a way that I could link the website to a Twitter feed for a much wider distribution. I personally do not interact very much with Twitter for like deliberately, right? Just because it's a bit of an overwhelming space and a super racist space. So I don't always like to go there. But I do think that is something like that I could consider and think about. I mean, part of what I did want to do with this website was, at least in my immediate network, which is not, very big, but and one of the things I'm kind of trying to do with computation in general, and as I apply it to authors like Gwendolyn Brooks, but also with authors like Tyson Bajess, other Black authors, is to hopefully cultivate or create a growing interest in sustaining and thinking about the work of Gwendolyn Brooks, right? But ideally what I would want to happen is for the generator to drive people into the actual text that is Riot. Gwendolyn Brooks is most well known for her single poem, We Real Cool. And it's a great poem. It's the most anthologized poem. And she's also on record saying, like, I did write other things, right? So, you know, and like and I've worked with that poem in combinatorial fashion as well. I have another generator actually that does stuff with Real Cool. But so my hope really is like it's just to sort of keep her work in some kind of foreground, right? Through computation, through digital work, in the hopes, right, that people are going to go to drive people back to the actual corpus, their entire corpus, right? Not just Riot, but everything, not just the Bean Eaters, not just, you know, but all of her work, you know, drive them into the corpus by manipulating a corpus, if that makes sense. So I am sort of thinking about, like, are there limitations to the digital space? Absolutely, right? Can everybody engage with it in a meaningful way? No. And then those are things that I'm still kind of like sorting out, right, through my practice.
How I would think about circulation, or the way that my thinking about circulation is changing through printing, is that so up until very recently, I really only thought of myself as a teacher of letterpress basics in a book history setting in a college or university. So every semester between 2008 and fall of 2020, I have had every one of my students set one line of type and print it on one press or another that I managed to, by hook or by crook, get access to. And one of the things that I have long sought to circulate was the look on somebody's face of either joy or confusion or both when they pull their first impression, and the joy of sort of seeing it happen, and also sometimes the confusion about what you get because you're pulling a proof and your P's and your Q's are not quite what you thought they were. So that's, that experience of printing is something that I've wanted everyone who I come into contact with to experience. And now that I have some small tabletop presses, I've thought about working with, you may have seen a little head and hands pop into my camera. I have a small child. So I've thought about involving, the press with their classmates and cohort. But I've only really recently begun to think of myself as a kind of practicing printer proper, and I haven't yet fully thought through, who the audiences are for that, who my audiences are for that, if any, because I've for so long sort of thought of myself as a teacher of letterpress for the purposes of understanding historical books. And though I've done a lot of occasional pieces, like there was a block party and I made free alphabets and gave free, broadside alphabets and gave them out to all the kids in the neighborhood. I'd like to do more work like that. And I'd like to do more book arts teaching specifically, that I've come too slowly. I should have realized this more quickly, that book history and book arts are similar, but they're not the same way of knowing. This is a thing that I'm learning through my own printing. And I guess I'll say one of my models is that my grandparents in their retirement at that press that they were standing at, they did a quarterly mailer. So 4 times a year, they would issue this thing that they called the keepsake. And they mailed it to about 100 of their friends. And they did this every 4 months from 1989 till the last of their deaths in 2006, although I printed and mailed the last one because it was in standing type but not finished. And so I've thought about a model like that, but that uses the mail much the way we use the mail, their model was why was what inspired me to have my students right now mailing little projects to each other, so we can experience something of the touch of a common page between us. But yeah, I guess those are the things that I am working with, and I think what'll come next is how to use what I can make on my own press to bring the sense of joy and pleasure that I see in my students when they pull their first impression ever. I know that that's possible through forms of the book and the book arts to bring to others. And I need to think more about what I can do and what forms my work could take to bring that around the state, as you had mentioned, and elsewhere.
Thanks.
I had a question for Lillian-Yvonne. I'm curious if you could speak a little bit about the pedagogy of something like the Brooks Project, and specifically the way you're moving back and forth across print and digital, page and screen. Do you have any dedicated courses in the MFA program that teaches students either combinatorial poetry or printing, or again, moving back and forth across them? Or do you tend to introduce that work more maybe incidentally, or maybe as a dedicated unit or module within a more traditional MFA class? I'm just incredibly interested in the pedagogy.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I do have a dedicated class for it called Exploratory Programming for creative writers. And we've made poetry generators, we've made, and some of them are not web-based, right? So I have web-based work for one, but a lot of the work that I do with the generator is not web-based. It's all in a programming environment. And then you kind of see like you don't see the back end, you see the front end when it ironically gets printed in a book or something. And that's, so I do teach that. And so some of the things that we've done in addition to web-based work is we've actually worked with actual hardware. So like microcomputers, and it's a way in which like we're making it very physical, right? The text or the voice or whatever it is in the program becomes very physical, and it becomes an object, right? An actual thing that you can touch, which I really like and I enjoy, and I sort of play around with different kinds of microcomputers as well. In another course that I taught once was actually kind of like a book arts course. And we didn't do programming, but we did work with augmented reality. And we made different, we ultimately made like artist books, but it was an opportunity. I mean, students were working with more than just printed things, but they were working with fabric, they were working with, and they were able to sort of like, invent different kinds of text objects or book objects like that. So I guess the short answer is yes, I do teach courses, and that's, and Jonathan was mentioning like the joy or the glee of watching a student pull their first print, and which really resonates with me, because I sometimes get students in these classes who they've never touched any kind of programming before. And it's just like, well, how do you even approach it? Part of why I teach the course is because I was faced with the same dilemma, right? Like, here's this thing I kind of want to do, but I have no idea how to approach it. I have no idea how to begin. I don't know where to start. And so when thinking about distribution too, I teach it so that I can make at least very basic aspects of it accessible to people for whom it might otherwise not be accessible. I am not I didn't take any computer science, anything like that. Programming is not anywhere it's in my lineage, but like way back, right? And not in any way that is useful. So it's something that like I teach myself continually to do and have to relearn how to do. But the joy, right, when they hit print and the program works, and like all of that is there, right? And it's like it becomes something real that they can do and that they can participate in, and it's another creative strategy for making, right, for poetics, for poesis. And I find that there's a lot of power in that, right? Being able to provide people the tools to do these things, especially things that can seem very out of reach, right? If you're not already in it, it's really hard to get into it.
Yeah. So as it happens, we in fact just had a question asking you both to speak a little bit more to joy and pleasure, and I think you sort of I think you did, and there's another question alongside of that also just came in that I think is a very rich one, and we probably have time for one more. So I'm just going to go ahead and read it and give each of you a chance to speak to it if you wish to. There's an interesting connection between Dr. Bertram's work with transparency and palimpsest and what's happening now with revisions to public monuments to racist icons, including projecting over them, etc. Can we hear about print in any modality as public performance rather than haptic experience? And I guess maybe the sort of real dichotomy there or opposition is between performance versus the kind of haptic materiality we've been lingering over. If that's something that either of you see a route to addressing.
Yeah, I'll talk about one that I'm familiar with. It's not something that.
And we just have a couple of minutes.
Sure. Yeah. So I'll talk about the combat or the combat/peace paper project folks who are originally a group of Iraq veterans against the war who pulp their army uniforms and then turn them into paper. They sometimes then produce books, print, or writing on them, but they will go and stand in a public square on a campus in a park and cut up their or others' military uniforms, and that itself is an act of public resistance. It is an act of public performance, but it is also about the haptic experience of the paper, because that performance itself is present when you touch the paper. They've done similar things with pulping old American flags. They've also made red paper by pulping MAGA shirts. And so there's been an interesting way in which that project is doing all of those things. The performance is in the haptic. It is also in when they stand somewhere and invite people to participate and watch in the process of making paper. So I think there's a lot of interesting ways to do that. That's just the one that comes to mind to me right now.
That's excellent. Thank you.
I think I would echo that. What Jonathan just said, that the public is the haptic as well. I think there are ways in which, now like a public performance, in the middle of a pandemic, a public performance is Instagram Live, right? or it's a virtual performance, or it's a digital performance, or a website can also be a public performance. And then those are just the things that come to mind. That's a really interesting question. In terms of thinking about revisions to monuments and print as a public performance. I'm thinking now about the projection, which who knows where I'll go with that, but I'll keep working at it.
Thank you both so much for two wonderful talks and a really, really engaging discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
you. And as we wrap up, just a reminder, this is the first of a 2-day series. So we have our roundtable panel coming up tomorrow. It's not too late to register for that. If we can put the email address into the chat where folks can write for the Eventbrite registration, that would be great. We will hear from tomorrow Victoria Law, who is a zine maker who works with incarcerated populations, Sarah Matthews, a printmaker and book artist, Amy Sue Woe, who works with textiles and questions of visibility and surveillance, and Rio Yanez, who is an artist and curator, recently had press in the LA Times for his project, printmaking project, which is printmaking on tortillas. So we'll hear from all 4 of them tomorrow, and we hope to see some of you back. Thank you so much, and good afternoon to everybody.